As Donald Trump wrapped up his visit to China, the US president claimed that he and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping saw eye to eye on Iran. Trump claimed that they have agreed that Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon and must reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
We did discuss Iran. We feel very similar to Iran. We want that to end. We don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. We want the straits open. We're closing it now. They closed it, and we closed it on top of them. But we want the straits open, and we want them to get it ended because it's a crazy thing. They're a little bit crazy, and it's no good. Can't have it. They cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Now, President Xi did not comment on his discussions with Trump about Iran, although China's foreign ministry issued a blunt statement outlining Beijing's frustration with the Iran war. It also called for opening of the vital shipping lanes, including the Strait of Hormuz. Now, after talks between Trump and Xi on Thursday, the White House said the leaders had agreed that the strait should be open and that Xi made clear China's opposition to the militarization of the waterway. But the Chinese statement did not mention anything on militarization or even Iran's nuclear ambitions. The statement said this conflict, which should never have happened, has no reason to continue. It also called for a lasting ceasefire in West Asia and demanded the reopening of key shipping lanes as soon as possible. Earlier, talking to Fox News, Trump also said that he is not going to be much more patient and Iran should make a deal. Trump had claimed that President Xi Jinping had offered China's help to open the Strait of Hormuz and pledged not to send military equipment to aid Iran. Listen to this.
President Xi would like to see a deal made. He would like to see a deal made. And he did offer, he said, if I can be of any help at all, I would like to be of help. Because,
he did say that.
Yeah, he did say that. And look, anybody that buys that much oil has obviously got some kind of a relationship with him. But he said, I would love to be a help. If I can be of any help whatsoever, he'd like to see the Hormuz Strait open. He said, if I can be of any help whatsoever, I would like to help.
But Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, struck a slightly different tone. He told NBC News that U.S. is not asking China for help with the situation in West Asia.
The Chinese side said they are not in favor of militarizing the Straits of Hormuz, and they're not in favor of a tolling system. And that's our position.
Now, in peacetime, the Hormuz Strait accounts for roughly a fifth of global oil and liquefied natural gas shipments, along with other key commodities. Iran's Revolutionary Guard said on Thursday that naval forces had allowed a number of Chinese ships to pass through the strategic strait. And for more on this, we're now being joined by Craig Spencer. He's an international affairs expert and China analyst. We also have with us Anne-Elizabeth Mutesh. She's a columnist at the London Telegraph. Thank you so much both for taking out time for us today. Now, before we get into the finer details, now, for months we know that Washington has tried almost every instrument in its toolbox against Tehran, be it military pressure, be it sanctions or maritime blockades and economic isolation. Yet Iran is still unwilling to blink, and now in Beijing, President Trump appears to be texting the external pressure through China now. Greg, is this Trump's last real chance to resolve the Hormuz crisis before the cost of confrontation outweighs the leverage of coercion, according to you?
No, I don't think so, because the four metrics that you mentioned, the four cards that President Trump has to play, he still has them. He still has the ability to block the blockade, the Iran, and as well as the Strait, and he has the military power to resume the military or the kinetic action, and other cards or tricks up his sleeve. So he could be patient, because if it's only a matter of time before Iran has to shut down their oil production because they have run out of storage. So I think the U.S. still has the cards to play. You have a bit of saber rattling from Xi, but and from the regime as well. But it's just that, it's just bluster, and so the cards are still with the U.S.
That's interesting. Now, Anne, would you agree with that assessment? Do you think that Washington still retains those cards and also has the appetite and patience to, wait it out, given that the midterms are also looming and the domestic pressure has, of course, been increasing?
I would say that the United States certainly has lots of means of pressure, but I don't think it is very comfortable for the United States to find themselves right now in a situation where as you said, there's domestic political pressure, there's international pressure to some extent, and China is it's both a partner and an adversary, to say something not too strong, of the United States. And it's the largest elephant in the room right now, because China has got massive economic pressure. It is under the threat of being left without oil and therefore not being able to make its huge economic machine work. And that is something that it takes very seriously. And I can see why President Trump is saying what he said on television for his domestic audience, that it can work, that he wants to make a deal. I do not necessarily think she wants to make a deal for the interests of the United States. She would like a deal to be made in the interest of China and China only. And the United States under President Trump, with great cause, has made China suffer through taxation, through tariffs, through a number of stances. We mustn't forget that in the run-up to this meeting, the Chinese made it clear, and President Xi made it clear, that, for instance, the status of Taiwan was the most important thing in this summit. With him and President Trump, which is not at all what President Trump would say. But America is committed to Taiwan remaining free. It's committed to the region, and its allies also do not want Taiwan to become a part of mainland China, so to speak, politically. So this is a much more imbricated and more complicated situation than just saying, we will wait it out, we can finish off Iran, it will take time. I'm not sure President Trump has all the time in the world.
And building on what Anne just said, Trump, even though he says that Xi Jinping assured him that China would not provide military equipment to Iran, and Beijing also signaled support for reopening the Strait of Hormuz, but how much weight should we really attach to these assurances? Because China may have influence over Tehran, but Iran is not exactly a client state that takes orders from Beijing. Greg, how are you reading into this?
Well, that's a good point, and I agree with Anne Elizabeth on several of her comments. But I do think ultimately you're right, Anne Elizabeth. The Xi doesn't want to appear to be helping the U.S. But on the other hand, 90% of Iran's oil goes to China. They're completely dependent on oil imports, and they cannot continue there. And I also agree they're under great economic pressure or economic strain. So, if you look at the GDP numbers, which I don't often believe because they're often exaggerated, but they've gone from the teens, 15% type numbers down to 5%, and I doubt that even the 5% numbers are legitimate. So, they're in a really tough position. They've gone from making market reforms in the 90s and early 2000s to back to reverting back to a real state-controlled economy. 2 years ago, their property prices were 300% of GDP. They've completely crashed, which is affecting the banking sector. And you've got 1/3 of the regional governments in China that are essentially bankrupt. So, this is a really difficult time for Xi. So, in spite of not wanting to help the U.S., he's got his own survival and the survival of the Chinese economic engine at stake here. So I think, I think the president can be patient. Yes, there's domestic pressure, but we can handle that. The president's thinking about the long term, which is something you usually attribute to China.
Right, and she could be in a difficult spot, but critics are divided on who has the real leverage in this situation, if it's China or if it's Washington. But critics have also been arguing that Trump desperately needs a geopolitical win at this moment, with pressure mounting domestically and internationally, as we were just discussing. But could that urgency push Trump towards a premature settlement? That's also a real fear that analysts have been voicing. And what do you make of it?
I think you're quite right. I think that is really the danger, that he yields to this. On the other hand, he has perfectly realized that Should he yield to China, that will be chalked up against him. Should he stop the war in Iran before he's attained his objectives, every single enemy of the United States will decide that it's open season, and the United States do not follow through. They haven't got the resolve to follow through, and I think that's the most important bit in this, even more than the economic pain being taken now. I think the most important point is that we are, in this instance, a question is, what will Russia think? Russia will think, fine, this is open season, we can do what we want, which they tend to think anyway. China will think, right, we still can command whatever we like because we don't have the resources, we have the people, but we have the massive economic production, and we can do what we want in Southeast Asia, not just Southwest Asia. So it's a test. And the inclination of President Trump is to make deals. He's got around him people who do take a geostrategic view. I think Secretary Rubio, in his very diplomatic way, is taking the geostrategic view, and it's open in the air. But I think I don't know exactly where it's going, and it's really a question of American resolve on this one.
Absolutely, and those were some very valid points. And Greg, now we understand that, when wounds are stitched shut before the infection is cleared, the surface heals briefly, but the deeper instability, it festers and often returns more violently. Is there a danger that if the US pulls back without fundamentally resolving Iran's capabilities, Tehran could emerge as a bigger problem for the United States and Israel than it was before February 28th? Because since February 28th, it's definitely become a bigger problem. Not just for the United States, for the entire world. How are you viewing this?
Yeah, it depends on the perspective. And yes, there's some economic hardships because the ships aren't coming through the strait, but that can be resolved as well. Whether it's the pressure on the Iranian economy that will force them to fold, or the U.S. Navy just has to ultimately clear the straits. And the blockade is working, obviously, but I think ultimately, I agree with Anne that the American resolve here is really important. And we've really eliminated or ended China's influence in Venezuela, in the Panama Canal. So they're basically retreating from the Western Hemisphere. We've got the same pressure on both Iran and China with the blockade. So there's been major changes. I think we'll see change in Cuba as well. So there's been really effective use of American power. And I hope that the president has the resolve to stick with the program in Iran and, free up the strait. The Iranian people also want that. So, and remember, the military capabilities of Iran, of the regime, have really been dialed down. So, yes, on one hand, there's some economic issues to deal with because of the trouble in the area. But on the other hand, the world is in a much safer place. So any sort of return to kinetic action will be a totally different story than we would have assumed a year ago when Iran had a navy, when they had defensive capabilities, when they could protect the skies over Iran. So much of the Iran military apparatus has been eliminated.
Right, and the situation, of course, remains delicate and it remains polarizing. But for now, thank you so much both for joining us on the broadcast and sharing your perspectives with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.